The last person to see Thomas Morse said he was walking toward the rocks. He wasn't alone. Someone was with him. Next morning, Thomas was gone. The question was simple: who was with him? Welcome to Secret Stories, where we uncover the mysteries hidden beneath the surface of history. Before we begin, if you enjoy uncovering the truth behind forgotten tales, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You will not want to miss what comes next. Now let us dive into a story that has haunted the Maine coast for nearly 3 centuries. October 1692, Salem, Massachusetts. The witch trials were at their peak. Fear had consumed the colony. Accusations flew like autumn leaves in the wind. But the madness did not stop at Salem's borders. It spread north into the coastal towns of Maine. In a small settlement along the rocky shore, a young woman named Sarah Whitmore stood before Magistrate Elijah Morse. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors who had known Sarah for years now whispered behind her back. The charges were simple: witchcraft. The evidence was thinner than morning mist. A cow had died. A child had fallen ill. Sarah lived alone near the shore. That was enough. Magistrate Morse looked down at Sarah from his elevated bench. His face was stone. His verdict was swift: guilty. Sarah was 30 years old. She had no family, no one to speak for her. The sentence was carried out that same evening. The villagers dragged her to the rocks at the edge of the shore. They bound her wrists to an iron ring embedded in the stone. The tide was low. They left her there. As the water rose around her ankles, Sarah looked back at the crowd gathered on the beach. Her eyes found Magistrate Morse. He stood apart from the others, watching. Sarah spoke. Her voice was calm, clear. "The seas do not forget. Neither do I." The tide came in. Sarah Whitmore drowned. Her body was never recovered. Neither was the rock to which she had been bound. The villagers returned the next morning at low tide. The iron ring was gone. The rock had vanished beneath the waves. The people tried to forget. They buried the trial records. They stopped speaking Sarah's name, but the sea remembers everything. October 1988, nearly 300 years later, the same stretch of Maine coastline. Thomas Morse was 63 years old. He had worked as a lighthouse keeper for 30 years. 30 years of solitude. 30 years of watching the waves. 30 years of keeping the light burning for ships that passed in the night. Thomas loved his job. He loved the rhythm of it, the predictability. Every evening at sunset, he climbed the spiral stairs to the lamp room. Every morning at dawn, he descended. In between, he read. He wrote in his journal. He listened to the wind and the gulls. Retirement was 3 days away. Thomas had circled the date on his calendar in red ink. November 1st. After 30 years, he would finally leave the lighthouse. He had already packed most of his belongings. The small apartment he had rented was waiting for him in town. But something had changed in the past few weeks. It started on October 2nd. Thomas was conducting his routine evening check of the perimeter. The sun had just set. The sky was bruised purple and orange. He walked along the rocky beach that curved below the lighthouse. The beam from the tower swept across the water every 15 seconds. That was when he saw her, a figure, standing on the rocks about 200 yards from shore. Right where the old maps marked a submerged formation, the locals called Sarah's Rock. Thomas stopped. He raised his binoculars. The figure was a woman. She wore a long dark dress. She stood completely still. The wind was strong that evening, but her dress did not move. Her hair did not move. Thomas lowered the binoculars. He blinked. When he looked again, she was gone. Fog, he thought. Just fog shaped like a person. It happens. But the next night, she was there again. Same place, same time. 22:47. Thomas checked his watch. He had noticed the time the previous night without thinking much of it. Now he noticed it again. The woman stood on Sarah's Rock. Thomas watched her through the binoculars for a full minute. She did not move. Then the lighthouse beam swept past, and when it returned, she was gone. On the third night, Thomas went down to the beach. He wanted to get closer. He walked along the shore until he was as near to Sarah's Rock as the tide would allow. The rock was only visible at low tide. Right now, the water was too high. The rock was submerged, but the woman was there. Standing on the water, or standing on the hidden rock beneath it, Thomas could not tell. He called out, "Hello, are you all right?" The wind swallowed his voice. The woman did not respond. She just stood there. Her face was turned toward the lighthouse. Toward him, Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. He turned and walked back to the lighthouse. He did not look behind him. The sightings continued, every night. Sometimes the woman appeared, sometimes she did not. But when she did appear, it was always at 22:47, always on Sarah's Rock, and each time she seemed a little closer. Thomas started keeping notes in his journal. He wrote down the date, the time, the weather conditions, whether she appeared or not. He told himself he was being scientific, observational, but the truth was he was unnerved. On October 10th, he saw details he had not noticed before. The woman's dress was not just dark. It was old-fashioned. Long sleeves, high collar, the kind of dress women wore in the 1600s. Her hair was long and loose. It hung past her shoulders. But her face, he could never see her face clearly. It was always turned slightly away, or shadowed, or obscured by the beam of the lighthouse sweeping past. Thomas began researching. The lighthouse had a small library, mostly navigation charts and maintenance logs, but there was also a shelf of local history books. Thomas pulled them down one by one. He found references to Sarah's Rock. The name dated back to colonial times. There were vague mentions of a woman named Sarah who had been accused of witchcraft. The details were sparse. Most of the trial records had been lost or destroyed. But in one brittle old book, Thomas found a single paragraph. It mentioned a Sarah Whitmore, accused in 1692, sentenced by Magistrate Elijah Morse, drowned at the rocks, age at death 30. Thomas stared at the name, Morse, his last name. He told himself it was a coincidence. Morse was not an uncommon name. Plenty of families shared it, but something gnawed at him. He kept reading. By mid-October, the woman was appearing every night, and she was closer now, no longer 200 yards away. Now she stood maybe 100 yards from shore, still on Sarah's Rock, but the rock itself seemed to be shifting, moving, coming closer to land. That was impossible, of course. Rocks do not move, but Thomas could not shake the feeling. On October 20th, Thomas went down to the beach at low tide. He wanted to see Sarah's Rock up close. He had passed it countless times over the years, but he had never really looked at it. The rock was large, flat on top, barnacled and slick with seaweed. And there, embedded in the stone near the center, was an iron ring, old, rusted, barely visible beneath the marine growth. Thomas crouched beside it. He brushed away the seaweed. The ring was thick, heavy, the kind of iron that had been forged by hand centuries ago. It was still anchored firmly in the rock. He ran his fingers over it. The metal was cold, rough. This was where they had tied her. This was where Sarah Whitmore had drowned. Thomas stood. He looked back toward the lighthouse. The beam swept across the water. For a moment, he thought he saw her, standing right where he was standing. Looking back at him, he blinked. She was gone. October 29th, 2 days before Halloween, 2 days before Thomas's final shift. The woman appeared every night now. She was close enough that Thomas could see her clearly without binoculars. She stood on Sarah's Rock. Her hands were held in front of her. As if bound, Thomas started hearing things. Faint sounds, whispers carried on the wind. He could not make out words. Just the rhythm of a voice, soft, insistent. He stopped sleeping well. When he did sleep, he dreamed of water, of rising tides, of a woman's face just beneath the surface looking up at him. On October 30th, Thomas made a decision. He opened his journal. He wrote carefully. His handwriting was steady, controlled. Tomorrow night is my last shift. 30 years will come to an end. It is also Halloween. The woman has been appearing for nearly a month now. I believe she is Sarah Whitmore. I believe she was innocent. I believe she was wronged. Tomorrow night at high tide, I'm going to the rock. I am going to break that iron ring. I am going to set her free, symbolically at least. It seems like the right thing to do. A good way to end 30 years. He closed the journal. He felt calm, resolved. October 31st, Halloween, Thomas's final shift. The day was gray, overcast. The wind was picking up. A storm was forecast for later that evening. Thomas went about his duties as usual. He checked the lamp. He checked the fuel. He radioed the Coast Guard to confirm his shift. At sunset, he climbed the stairs one last time. He lit the lamp. The beam began its slow rotation, 15 seconds, over and over. At 2200 hours, Thomas made his final radio call. His voice was calm, matter of fact. "This is Keeper Morse at Point Refuge Light. Final check-in. All systems operational. Over!" The dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Copy that, Keeper Morse. We will see you in the morning. Congratulations on your retirement. Over. Thank you." Over and out. Thomas set down the radio. He looked out the window. The tide was rising. In another hour, it would be high. Sarah's rock would be submerged. He waited. At 23:14, Thomas picked up the radio again. He pressed the transmit button. His voice was steady. "I am going to the rock." He set the radio down. He put on his coat. He walked down the spiral stairs. He stepped outside into the cold October night. A local fisherman named Dale Crawford was securing his boat in the small harbor, half a mile from the lighthouse. He happened to glance toward the rocks. He saw a figure walking along the beach, a man, Thomas Morse. Dale recognized the lighthouse keeper's coat, but Thomas was not alone. There was someone with him, walking beside him. Dale could not see clearly in the dark, but it looked like a woman, tall, wearing a long dark dress. Dale watched for a moment. Then a wave splashed over the bow of his boat, and he turned his attention back to his work. When he looked again, the beach was empty. November 1st, morning. The Coast Guard cutter arrived at Point Refuge Light at 0600 hours. The storm had passed. The sky was clear. The sea was calm. The lighthouse was functioning perfectly. The beam was still rotating. The fuel levels were normal. Everything was in order, except Thomas Morse was gone. The crew searched the lighthouse. His coat was missing. His boots were missing. But everything else was where it should be. The logbook was up to date. The last entry was from the previous evening. 2200 hours. All systems operational. On the desk in the keeper's quarters, they found Thomas's journal. It was open. The last page. In the center of the page, in shaky red handwriting, was a single number. 30. The writing trembled. The ink was red. Or was it ink? The Coast Guard officers did not touch it. They took photographs. They sealed the journal as evidence. They searched the beach. They found Thomas's coat on Sarah's rock. It was soaked, but there were no footprints. No signs of a struggle, no body. Thomas Morse had vanished. The investigation was assigned to Detective Susan Miller of the Maine State Police. She was thorough, methodical. She interviewed everyone who had known Thomas. She reviewed the lighthouse logs. She examined the journal. The red number on the last page bothered her. The lab analyzed it. The report came back inconclusive. The substance was organic, but they could not definitively say whether it was blood or ink or something else. Detective Miller began digging into local history. She wanted to understand the references Thomas had made in his earlier journal entries. Sarah Whitmore, Sarah's Rock, the witch trials. What she found disturbed her. She pulled records from the county archives. Old documents, faded and brittle. She went back decades. Then a century. Then further. She found a pattern. Every 30 years, someone with the last name Morse disappeared from the area around Point Refuge Light. Always in late October. Always around Halloween. No bodies were ever found. 1722. James Morse, fisherman, disappeared October 28th. Last seen near the rocks. 1752. Robert Morse, ship captain, disappeared October 30th. Boat found empty off the coast. 1782. Samuel Morse, coastal watchman, disappeared October 29th. Never seen again. 1812. Daniel Morse, merchant, disappeared October 31st. Last seen walking toward the shore. 1842. William Morse, sailor, disappeared October 27th. Body never recovered. 1872. Henry Morse, lighthouse keeper, disappeared Halloween night. Lighthouse found operational. 1902. George Morse, lighthouse keeper, disappeared October 30th. No trace. 1932. Edward Morse, lighthouse keeper, disappeared October 28th. Vanished during his shift. 1958. Peter Morse, fisherman, disappeared October 29th. Boat found adrift. 1988. Thomas Morse, lighthouse keeper, disappeared October 31st. Last radio call, I'm going to the Rock. 10 disappearances. 10 men, all named Morse, all gone in late October. All within a 30-year cycle. Detective Miller traced the genealogy. It took weeks, but the records were there. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, death records. Every single one of the missing men was a direct descendant of Magistrate Elijah Morse, the man who had condemned Sarah Whitmore to death in 1692. Thomas Morse was the 8th generation. The last direct male heir. Detective Miller sat in her office. She stared at the timeline she had constructed. 1692 to 1988. 296 years. 10 disappearances. One every 30 years. She pulled the trial record she had found in the archives. Sarah Whitmore, born 1662, died 1692, age at death 30. 30 years old, 30-year cycle. Detective Miller closed the file. She leaned back in her chair. She looked out the window toward the coast, toward Point Refuge Light, toward Sarah's Rock. 3 months later, Detective Miller returned to the lighthouse. She wanted to see Sarah's Rock one more time. It was low tide. The rock was exposed. She walked across the beach. She climbed onto the flat stone surface. She looked for the iron ring Thomas had described in his journal. It was there, but it was no longer intact. The ring had been broken, snapped clean through. The metal was still embedded in the rock, but the loop had been severed, as if someone had taken a hammer and chisel and cut it apart, or as if something with tremendous force had simply pulled it open. Detective Miller stood on the rock. She looked back toward the lighthouse. The beam swept across the water, over and over. 15 seconds, the same rhythm it had kept for 100 years. She thought about Thomas Morse. She thought about the 10 men who had disappeared. She thought about Sarah Whitmore, a woman who had been 30 years old when she drowned. A woman who had promised that the seas do not forget. Detective Miller climbed down from the rock. She walked back to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time. Then she pulled out her notebook. She wrote a single line. The debt is paid. She closed the file on Thomas Morse. Officially, it remained an unsolved missing persons case. But Detective Miller knew she did not have proof. She would never have proof. But she knew. Sarah Whitmore had taken 30 years from Magistrate Elijah Morse's bloodline for every year of her own stolen life. 10 men, 300 years of waiting. One life taken every 30 years. Thomas Morse had been the 10th, the last direct descendant. The cycle was complete. That evening, Detective Miller drove back to the coast one final time. She stood on the beach. She watched the lighthouse beam sweep across the water. At 22:47, she looked toward Sarah's Rock. For just a moment, she thought she saw something. A figure, a woman in a long dark dress, standing on the rock. But this time the woman was not looking toward the shore. She was turned away, facing the open sea. Detective Miller blinked. The beam swept past. When it returned, the rock was empty. The next morning, a local fisherman reported something strange. He said the old stories about Sarah's Rock had changed. The rock was quiet now. No more cold spots. No more strange sounds. No more feelings of dread. The fishermen started calling it by a different name. They called it Forgiven Rock, but most people just called it the Rock, and they stopped talking about it altogether. November 1988, the Coast Guard decommissioned Point Refuge Light. Automated systems took over. No keeper was needed anymore. The lighthouse still stands. The beam still sweeps across the water every 15 seconds, but no one lives there now. Thomas Morse's journal was returned to his sister. She read it once, then she locked it away. She never spoke about her brother's disappearance. When people asked, she said only one thing. He found what he was looking for. On the last page of that journal, the red number 30 remains. The lab never determined what it was. Blood, ink, something else. It does not matter anymore. What matters is this. Sarah Whitmore was 30 years old when she died. She waited 30 years between each reckoning. She took 10 men over the course of 296 years. The math is simple. The math is exact. 30 years of life stolen, 30 years of waiting, 10 men, 300 years. The seas do not forget, and neither did she. Today, if you visit the Maine coast near Point Refuge Light, you can still see Sarah's Rock at low tide. The iron ring is still there, broken, rusted, covered in seaweed, Tour guides sometimes mention the old stories, the witch trials, the disappearances, the 30-year cycle. But they laugh when they tell it. They call it folklore, a local legend, but the fishermen know better. They do not anchor near Sarah's Rock. They do not speak her name, and on Halloween night they stay in port, because some debts take centuries to pay, and some promises are kept long after death. Thomas Morse walked to Sarah's Rock on Halloween night, 1988. He went willingly. He went to set her free. And in a way he did. The question is not whether Sarah Whitmore's ghost haunted that coast for nearly 300 years. The question is simpler. The question is this. When Thomas Morse walked toward those rocks on that cold October night, when the fisherman saw him with someone by his side, when he whispered into his radio, "I am going to the rock," did he know he would not come back? Or did he believe he could break a curse that had waited 30 decades for justice? We will never know. What we do know is this. Thomas Morse was the last, the 10th man, the final descendant of Magistrate Elijah Morse. And after he disappeared, the sightings stopped. Sarah's Rock is quiet now. The lighthouse still burns. The tide still rises and falls. But the woman in the long dark dress, she is gone. Some say she finally found peace. Some say the debt was paid. Some say Thomas Morse gave his life to break a curse he did not create. But the fishermen, the ones who have worked these waters for generations, they say something different. They say Sarah Whitmore was never looking for revenge. She was looking for acknowledgement, for someone from the bloodline that condemned her to finally see her, to finally recognize the injustice. And Thomas Morse did. He saw her. He researched her story. He believed she was innocent. And on his last night, he walked to the rock where she had died. Not because he was forced, but because he chose to. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all she ever wanted. The seas do not forget, but perhaps after 300 years they can forgive. Sarah's Rock still stands. The iron ring is still broken. And on quiet October nights, when the moon is full and the tide is high, some say you can still see a figure on the rocks. But she is not looking toward the shore anymore. She is looking out to sea, walking away, finally free.